And we've been going through the various stories from the White Lotus Sutra. The White Lotus Sutra is a Mahayana text, so came from about, I don't know when it was put down. Actually, they think it was written over various periods and sort of added to over hundreds of years. Actually, is the thinking from various different sources. So it doesn't have one particular source, and we've been going through it over the last few weeks. The various stories from the White Lotus Sutra, and this evening we're going to be looking at the divine physician. It's the Buddha as the divine physician. Now, there is a story to this section of it as sort of elucidating the Buddha as the divine physician, but I'm afraid I couldn't make head nor tail of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little around the theme that you see actually pop up quite a bit in the Buddhist tradition. Particularly actually even in the Pali Canon, which is the original oral teachings of the Buddha, that looks at the Buddha as a sort of health bringer. In fact, if you go back to the time of the Buddha is one epithet that was given to Gautama, and Buddha basically means enlightened one or awakened one. But actually he had various other epithets. One of them actually was a bull of a man. You don't hear that one too much, but a bull of a man was one of the epithets of the Buddha, which gives a sense of his sort of gravitas and kind of weight. But another one was the Jinnah, which is the conqueror. So he had various different epithets, and it's actually only probably by historical contingency that we know the Buddha as the Buddha. So one of the epithets of the Buddha was the great physician, the ultimate, the Maha Bhaihasaja. And this epithet of the great physician could have been the way that we think of the Buddha today, but it's not. But you often see this sort of theme of health and healing and movement away from disease come up in the various Pali Canon stories. So, say for example, the three root poisons of our unenlightened experience, craving, hatred, and delusion. Well, they're named as poisons. They're seen as poisons, which again has sort of evokes a sense of disease or illness that those poisons bring about. The path is often referred to as the path of purification, the Vishuddhimagga, and it's seen as the path as practicing the path is seen as purifying, which again has suggestions of moving from a state of ill health towards one of health in the whole idea of purification, particularly purification of these three poisons: craving, hatred, and delusion, and it's often seen, interestingly enough, that purification is purification of emotional states, so mental states, but also interestingly views. If you look at some of the canon, some of the stories from the Buddha, when he's talking about this path of purification, this path of purifying your whole being, what's often emphasized is yes, emotional states, mental states, but also views as well. You sometimes get that, don't you, when you hear something from somebody, it's like it's a slightly ugly opinion. Maybe, I don't know, it might be slightly righteous or hateful or whatever it might be, and you sort of go, ooh. So this path of purification is a path of purification of views as well, very often. You'll see it as well if people might have come across the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths are one of the sort of core teachings of Buddhism, and they are copied on the old Vedic system of medicine. So at the Buddha's time, you would have had Vedic medical ways of diagnosing, which was it went the disease, the cause of the disease, the state of freedom from disease, and the remedy to bring about that state of freedom from disease. And you see that in the Four Noble Truths as well. So in the Four Noble Truths, you have the disease, or you have the disease, which is suffering, all unenlightened experience is unsatisfactory or involves suffering. It's the first noble truth. The state that brings about that disease, or the cause of that disease, which in Buddhism is seen as craving, that's the sort of core, the root poison that brings about that disease. The state of freedom from disease, which is enlightenment, and the thing that brings about that freedom from that disease, which is the Noble Eightfold Path, or any of the number of the various different ways that sometimes the Buddhist tradition is put out. So you've seen quite repeatedly this idea of our unenlightened conditioned experience being basically one of ill health, sort of talked analogously as one of ill health or disease, and the state of enlightenment, or the state of awakening, the Buddha's awakening, being one of health, being one of perfect health. Now, of course, we're not talking about health in the sense of, we can get out of bed and go and run a mile and, climb a mountain or whatever it might be. We're talking about like health beyond our wildest imagination, not even physical, but emotionally and mental. An enlightened being could be, say, completely racked with illness and disease or whatever it might be, but actually from a particular perspective be far more healthy in outlook, healthy in positivity, healthy in in virtue, all of those things, far more so than somebody in perfect health but who was racked by anger or craving or hatred or whatever it might have been. So you see that come up very, very regularly in the Pali Canon. But what I thought we could do is, because it might not be something that particularly resonates with us, or it might be. So what I thought we could do is just briefly, is we could just discuss between ourselves, is that something that we could, thinking of our spiritual path or our Buddhist lives in that particular way, as moving away from a state of ill health towards a state of health, is that something that we could resonate with? Is it something that actually you think, I could think of my spiritual life in that way? So why don't you do that? Why don't we get into groups of, say, threes, and I'll give you about 5 minutes, and then I'll ring a bell again. So just introduce yourself to somebody, and you can go around, yeah? Great. So what do we think? Is that a useful analogy to think of spiritual life in that way? A few nodding heads. Why is that? Yeah. We'll go over here.
Yeah, just, I'm slightly maybe off track, but trying to stick to Buddhism. I feel that as everything has a kind of frequency, even if we have a physical illness, but how we choose to view it. If we get angry about it, if we get resentful about it, if we resist it, will it carry on the disease? Or can we free ourselves with acceptance and peace, and maybe send love to it? I'm not saying it might heal it, or it goes so fast, but for me everything comes down to kind of frequency. So that for me is how it starts for me.
It's interesting, isn't it, when you have people sometimes when they get sick, they get sickly, don't they? And when you have some people actually when they're sick, they're just fine. It's like, this is what happens. I have a human body, it becomes unwell, and that's right.
But if you send what personally I found, because I've had ill health, if I'm angry at the illness, it will make it worse.
Yes, that's right.
And if you send love and compassion to the illness, I personally just experienced it will make a big difference.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, I think also we're just having an interesting conversation of a rural group of people that lived up on the mountains, for instance, in the way that their health is affected by the environment they live in. And ironically, that they seem to be, in body and mind, at more at rest and more less stressed than we would be in the city.
That's right. That's right. So there's a connection, isn't there? If Well, apparently what I'm told is actually if you look at life expectancy in people, if they have social connection, a sense of meaning or higher purpose in their life and connection with nature, you tend almost invariably to have longer lives, which is interesting. So even our physical health does seem to be related some way to our emotional health. I quite like it. It works for me, and the reason is it's quite close to my experience. You know, when I've been sort of angry, or if I've consumed anger in some sort of way, I feel poisoned. Like I remember a few Christmases back, I used to watch a lot of I did politics as a degree. I used to watch it, and of course now it's so full of sort of anger and bitterness now. And I remember one particular Christmas I was just bored, so I ended up watching like loads of podcasts, loads of political podcasts and talk shows and everything like that. And over about 3 or 4 hours, I just consumed loads of anger. Like I just consumed all this media with loads of anger in it. And I remember going for a walk and feeling like I just drunk poison. That was the feeling. I was like, oh, yuck. I wanted to get into the shower. I felt like it was on my skin or something. It was awful. So it seems to sort of work for me. And when I think of when I'm in more negative mental states, maybe craving mental states or angry mental states, everything's often very hard work, isn't it? It's a bit like you're sick, a bit like you're ill. What's said about negative mental states is they sort of drain away the energy that we have. They sort of seep them away. They're really exhausting, aren't they? When you're angry, anger is a really exhausting emotional state that you sort of have to carry along with you all day long. It's hard work, you know. You feel shattered at the end of the day if you're not in a particularly positive mental state. So it's a bit like being unwell like that. Everything becomes a bit of a slog. The other interesting thing about it is that you very often isolate yourself from other people when you're in negative mental states, don't you? A bit like, say, for example, if you were ill. I used to have this because before I came across Buddhism, I was a very sort of alienated and also angry young man. And I think the two were related, actually. I think it was like, because, you know, if you've got something like anger, it's this explosive thing that can go off at any one time. It's a bit like somebody once described it to me, it's a bit like you've got this sort of radioactive substance that you're kind of carrying around and kind of going, you're sort of subliminally, and people are reading it off you, you're kind of going, just stay back, folks, because this can go, like you don't trust yourself with it, this can go off. So you tend to, I think, by natural inclination, tend to isolate yourself quite strongly when you're in negative mental states. And I think also people sort of read negative mental states very, very quickly off us as well, and tend to avoid us. They tend to give us a bit of a wide berth if we're in particularly negative mental states. So it isolates us in the same sort of way. Anger or craving or resentment or jealousy or whatever it might be tends to isolate us in the same way as if we were ill. It's also, interestingly enough, extremely contagious. You ever know that the reason people isolate us is because negative mental states are extremely contagious. Again, anger is quite a good example on this one. You only have to be around an angry person for a period of time before you find yourself becoming irritated and angry and sort of grumpy as well. I've noticed this, say for example, if you talk, I remember giving a class once, we always get told as teachers that you have to be very, very careful in talking particularly about anger, because what it tends to do is evoke it. If you talk about anger enough in other people, or actually any negative mental state in other people for long enough, what it tends to do is evoke it in other people. I remember years ago giving a class where the whole class was about anger, which was really ill-advised, because that's not such a good idea. And I remember looking up at the class at about 15 minutes in, and there was like this dark cloud over everybody. You could tell everybody had just got really annoyed because I just sort of evoked this state in people by talking about it. So it's highly, emotional states, mental states are highly contagious like that as well. And we tend to pick them up a bit like they were sort of an illness in a certain way. It's interesting, isn't it, how sort of the body is all often very analogous to the mind. It corresponds to the mind. Rules of the body also tend to be rules or principles of the mind. Like if you think of sort of positive qualities of the body, let's say flexibility or strength or balance or whatever it might be, you can also refer to the mind in those particular ways, and it evokes certain qualities of the mind. But one of the interesting, I was reading Ian McGilchrist a little while ago, and he was saying, interestingly enough, one of the things that the body needs in order to grow is resistance. So that might be weight training or yoga or whatever it might be. The body needs resistance to grow. And he was saying also the mind needs resistance to grow, i.e. it needs a problem with which to grapple with. It needs something to sort of come up against that it has to move. So you get these sort of interesting sort of correspondences between body and mind very often, don't you? And so similarly, you can use the metaphors of body, like say, for example, with illness, with the mind as well. So when we're in a healthy state of mind, and I'll get off the negative onto the positive, when we're in a healthy state of mind, we feel the opposite, don't we? We feel sort of energized, we feel sort of bright, we feel kind of, we have the capacity to do things, we feel whole. Like that's that when we're on retreat, for example, we suddenly become more sort of whole, don't we? Where we're sort of thinned out very often, or a bit like a pancake, sort of flattened out or thinned out. When we're on retreat, it's like more of us comes on board and we feel whole. It's interesting that if you think of whole and wholesome, is etymologically related to the word holy, is also etymologically related to the word halo, which if you see, for example, in the Buddha, you might see this. It exists in the Buddhist tradition as well as the Christian tradition, where you see these sort of halos around people. The Buddha's got one here. It's said to be his wisdom halo. So the wisdom halo is the halo around his head, and his merit halo, i.e. his body halo, so the halo that comes from his skillful deeds, his positive actions, is this broader one out here. And the merit halo, actually, the punya halo, is said to be protective. It's said to actually have a sort of force which gives protection, which gives sort of which guards in a certain way. But it's related to this word of healthy and whole and wholesome. So you get these sort of interesting sort of links. But the connection is that it's whole, don't you? When you feel sort of more positive, well, you just feel more sort of whole as well. It's like little bits of you aren't doing several hundred different things and being pulled in different directions with conflicting things that you'd like to do. It's like all of you is just in one place and whole. And then, of course, you have a perfuming effect on people around you, so people sort of want to come closer to you. They want to be around you much more, and as opposed to sort of pushing people away. And interestingly enough, whereas negative mental states, if you see people where negative mental states have played on their minds for long enough, they often become quite ugly, don't they? It gets etched on their face. Did your mum ever say to you, maybe this was an Irish mum thing, but if you made faces at your siblings, my mum would say, be careful now, the wind will change and you'll be stuck like that. You see that with people, don't you, where decades of sort of ill will or hatred have just etched themselves into their faces. And people who are very positive and very loving and very affectionate just become beautiful in their own sort of way, irrespective of physical experience. They sort of become beautiful. Interestingly enough, the metta bhavana is said to be the practice to make one better looking. So if you're ever struggling to get up in the morning, and being a little bit more angelic doesn't quite do it for you. Well, how about being a little bit more beautiful? Huh? You get up and do a metta bhavana and be more beautiful after it. So we're a very good-looking bunch, but we can always do with a hand, can't we? So I thought what we could do is we could do a metta bhavana, and then we'll come back and we'll discuss it after. So between myself and the Sanghadharan, let's see how far we can stretch this metaphor out this evening. We might butcher it by the end of the evening, you never know, but anyway, we can get a few more miles out of it yet. So if one of the things that I was thinking in the first half is if the Buddha is seen as the sort of supreme physician, the ultimate physician, he's quite an old school physician. He's definitely an old school physician. If you sort of read in classical literature, when somebody, they have something, gout or something, that's usually what they have in the 16th century, isn't it? And they go to the physician. Well, the physician is going to prescribe them a regimen, isn't he? He's going to prescribe them something that's actually going to be quite sort of vigorous. He's going to tell them to take the summer air in Florence or something like that, and a cold bath every day, and avoid any heavy meals, and a walk of 5 miles every second day or something like that. He's going to prescribe a regimen. Now, if you go to some physicians today, they'll give you pills. Whatever particular difficulty you've got. Some doctors are very good. They'll say, look, and you need to do all this. But a lot of the time, the impression is they'll give you pills, won't they? And it's an immediate sort of cure-all. And of course, gosh, aren't we lucky? Like, let's face it, we're blessed to have that sort of Western medicine available to us. But a lot of the time, that easy cure-all pill solution is just not going to work. So the Buddha is not going to, as a physician, is not going to rescue us with a pill. He's not going to give us something that's just going to make it all better. What he's going to do is he's going to give you a regimen. He's going to give you a regimen of meditation, of friendship, of study, of ritual, of appreciation of the arts, of maybe even taking care of yourself better physically. All of those things, he's going to give you a full regimen to come to this state of health that we know as enlightenment. So he's not going to rescue us. He's not a physician that's going to rescue us in that particular way. And so often these days, or maybe always, maybe it's just the human tendency, we look to be rescued, don't we? Maybe it comes from being a child, and when you're a child, you're so sort of vulnerable. Your parents are there to sort of rescue you. You look to them to do that. And of course, when sometimes we grow up, or at least grow older, maybe without growing up, we start looking for that around us as well. And we look to our romantic relationships, or we look to our psychotherapist, or we look to, whatever it is, somebody to rescue us. And of course, what the Buddha is saying as the great physician is, look, you can only cure yourself. You can only rescue yourself in this way. I was talking to a friend not long ago who's got himself into one hell of a pickle, and he's not in a very good state at all. And he, like many of us, myself included, when he gets into these states, he gets passive. He just sort of stops. He collapses. And one of the things I said to him is, look, brother, the cavalry is not about to arrive. There is nobody coming to the rescue. You're going to have to figure this one out for yourself. And slowly, that's what he's doing. Actually, he is engaging in a regimen, and it's really helping. So this whole way of looking at disease and health, it strikes on something that's a sort of tangentially related, actually, which is the whole thing of thinking about the spiritual life in both the negative and the positive form. So traditionally in Buddhism, Buddhism has mostly described the spiritual life in negative form. Yeah? So if you look to particularly the Buddha's oral teachings, if you open up the Pali Canon, usually the way that the path is described is in the negative form. Now, I don't mean by the negative form, I don't mean like the morally negative. I mean in the sense of negation. Yeah? So the absence of this, or the elimination of this, or the eradication of this, or not that. So mostly what you'll see, say for example, nirvana described as, enlightenment described as, is the elimination of suffering, or the end of samsara, of conditionality, or it's the absence of greed, hatred and delusion. Even states like love, for example, is often described as not hate. It's not in the majority described in the positive format as love or empathy or compassion or whatever it might be. It's described as not hate. So the initial, certainly if you go back to the original Buddhist teachings, you'll get lots of sort of via negativa. That's what's called the via negativa, the path of negation, basically. The path of negativity comes from, it's a Christian term actually, which is the idea that there's no positive word that you can describe God with. You have to look to negation, negative terms, to try and get at it. Now, there is a good reason for this, and that's often because, say, for example, if you describe the spiritual path in positive terms, which the Pali Canon does actually do as well, and the later Mahayana, which we've been looking at with these stories, does actually do as well. So it describes enlightenment as the cool shore, as liberation, as the cool cave, as liberation, as the further shore, as the place of peace, the abode of peace. There are positive ways of putting the spiritual path, but the danger of putting them in those sort of positive ways is that very often we'll think of the term, let's say for example, if in describing the spiritual life as a place of perfect health, we will take what we understand of that term in a very worldly way, in our own sort of very sort of muddled way, and think and sort of fill out that quality with our own projection. So then we sort of have a very mixed up view as to what enlightenment might be. You do this with love, for example. The danger of talking about love in the spiritual life is we think of it as romantic love, or sort of sticky love, clingy love, love with attachment. Yeah? Whereas with the enlightened mind, love is completely free from all attachment or clinging or craving whatsoever. And it's a state that we probably can't even imagine. Like to have this sort of intensity of love that would be as strong and much more of the most strong feelings of sort of falling in love as you could possibly imagine. Sometimes described as like a mother's love for her only child. The most intense love you could possibly imagine, but completely free from any attachment whatsoever. So completely free of conditions or provisos or clinging or anything like that. So the danger is in describing things in positive terms is that we confuse it in that particular way. Now I thought what we could do is, why don't we just for a couple of minutes, we are going to come back and I'll tell you how this relates to the whole idea of health and the great physician. But just between ourselves, and maybe we'll just do it in twos, we'll just do it a bit more briefly. We could just say, what's the danger of putting the spiritual life in that negative form, as in negation, not negative morally or skillfully, but is in the sense of negation, or the absence of something, basically. So what might be the danger or the pitfalls of that? So I've just described what might be the pitfalls of putting it in the positive. Let's see if we can have a think, just maybe for 2 minutes, think what might be the danger of putting it in the negative like that. Why don't you give it a go? Turn to somebody and I'll ring a bell in a couple of minutes. Yeah? So what do we think? What's the dangers of describing? Yeah.
It could lead to more questions.
Mm.
So let's say I want to describe hate.
Yep.
So I say not love.
Yep.
But then I'm going to start wondering, oh, it could be this, it could be that, it
Mm.
could be this.
Yeah.
Even though it brings a sense of lightness,
Mm.
there's a possibility of going down a rabbit hole.
Yes. Yeah. So if you were describing, let's say, Buddhism, it says not hate and trying to describe love. It doesn't tell you quite what it is either. It tells you what is the absence of. And to a certain extent, actually, if you just work on eliminating hate, what you will experience is love. So there is something to that. There is a natural arising of love where you eliminate hate. But it doesn't tell you what it is that you're getting at. So it's sort of hard to kind of steer. Yeah, that's right, yeah. Yeah, right.
We've focused on the risk of almost covering over the reality of a situation with the extremes. And that's the kind of line we went down, and how the potential for, not love or not hate, but actually it just creates another kind of illusion over the surface of actual reality.
Do you mean like in the sense of, could you say about how maybe it would create the illusion? What was the...
I guess just diverting focus.
Right.
That kind of wrong view.
Yeah.
And bringing you onto something else that is actually of less attention.
Yes, yeah, that's right. Or maybe it just gets a bit heady or something like that. Yeah, that's right, yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
I was thinking that if, with a lot of negation, it doesn't really offer like an alternative. It kind of feels like an absence, or you're kind of taking away a lot of things.
Yeah.
Say like with like suffering and stuff like that, and especially for someone who maybe identifies with the suffering, or identifies with the way your current life is. Like talking about kind of a path as a view, kind of stripping all that back.
Yes.
Feel kind of empty, or feel a bit like you don't really know
what's left.
What's there.
That's right. Yeah. That's a very good point. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, actually. But I think as well, what you're also getting at, if I'm right in saying, is that there doesn't seem to be much motivation in it. It's sort of, there's lots of stick, but maybe not much carrot. There's not something at the end where you can go, oh yeah, that's where I'm definitely aimed at, with a real sense of positive content to it. And that can just be a bit unmotivating, a bit dry or something like that. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah. No, that's right.
I think that is a risk to see the life like so challenging and like in a bad way. Don't see it like the beauty of life.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I think that's a little similar what this previous lady was saying as well. So I think that's right. So what you get, say, for example, this whole analogy of disease and health, is you get both the via negativa in the sense of the elimination of disease, so the elimination of greed, hatred and delusion, and you get the via positiva of health. What you're aiming at is a state of health. Now, the problem with the via negativa is that we very often come to, or describing the path in terms of negation or the elimination of certain things, is that we very often come to the path, come to Buddhism or come to the center here in a lot of suffering. We've already got suffering right at the center of our lives, and it's a huge motivator to get away from that. That's completely understandable. You want to remove that suffering. Similarly, then, when you sit down to meditate, and we teach people how to meditate in a beginner's class for the first time, what do is we tell people, or we train people how to relax into or to sit with difficulty, with discomfort, with emotional negativity, whatever it might be, just sort of relax into that state. And usually what we tell people is to turn towards it, open up around it, relax into it, everything like that. So all of a sudden, before you know it, you've got a spiritual life that is honed into and looking for difficulty and suffering in a very, very strong way. Meditation can get like this as well, can't it? It can be like sort of, okay, my job is to eliminate difficulty in it. And as soon as you sit down to start meditating, you're looking for discomfort and suffering, whatever it might be, in which order to relax into. Now, before you know it, when you do that, you've started to make suffering very real and positive mental states very secondary. So you get this sometimes, for example, with people when they go on retreat. You'll hear from them, and a fantastic retreat will be one that was really horrible. It was just had all this stuff come up. I had all of this negativity come up, and it was fantastic. You're like, it doesn't sound fantastic. It sounds quite hard, actually. But very often, if your spiritual life is oriented towards finding and resolving and transforming negativity purely in that way, without a positive vision, before you know it, you've privileged suffering in your experience over positivity and love and affection and all the positive virtues. And before you know it, what you'll do is you'll just amplify and sort of unfold negativity and suffering more and more, because that becomes the center of your spiritual life. You keep looking for it, and of course anything that you keep looking for, you'll keep finding. So it sort of just unrolls it more and more. As soon as you look, because it's the thing you're looking for, you'll find it. Which, of course, when suffering and negativity gets the podium position like that, it likes to keep it. It doesn't want to let go of that lightly. So you get it as well. For example, if you have people talk, people here will say, "Oh, we had a really deep and meaningful communication," which usually just means that they just swapped suffering. Which they just swap stories of suffering. It's not that deep and it's not that meaningful. So what we're looking to do is we're looking to sort of privilege the positive and what's good in our lives as much as we possibly can as well. Actually, in Buddhism, what's positive, what's loving, what's courageous, what's robust, what's generous, what's patient, what's kind, what all of those things has much more reality to it, i.e. is in line with reality, much more than negativity. So when we go looking for negativity in our practice like that, and we privilege it like that, what happens is we give something of actually unreality our awareness and attention all the time. So the danger of sort of having, let's say, this metaphor of healing is that it assumes sickness or perpetuates sickness. There's this guy I follow. I don't know if people have ever seen this guy on Instagram called Rob Van Bern. He's a South African guy. I might have got his name wrong. But he sort of does sketches on kind of like healing circles, like sort of ayahuasca healing circles and stuff like that. You've seen the thing, it's tragic. And you all go off to the rainforest and like take ayahuasca, and like it's a whole caricature of itself basically. But this guy caricatures it very well. He starts every sketch. I won't try the South African accent because it's quite tricky. But he starts every sketch with blessings and kombucha be upon you. So blessings and kombucha be upon you. And then he ends every sketch with stay damaged and keep healing. Because of course, as long as your spiritual life, quote unquote, if you want to call whatever that monstrosity is a spiritual life, is about healing, it assumes damage. So you just perpetuate damage all the time. As long as you are healing, it's assuming you're sick. I had a friend not long ago take a year off work to do a year of healing. That's what he described it. as. And I said, well, you might as well describe it a year of sickness, because as long as you're healing in that year, you're sick. Yeah. So, and your mind hears that message. Like, don't think that your mind doesn't actually pick up on that the focus is suddenly being put on suffering and disease and the recovery from that, as opposed to something of health, of vitality, of love, which is of no relation to all the negative, sickness or disease, whatever it might be. So there's a real risk actually of seeing your spiritual life or your life just broadly, generally, in terms of healing. It might be that, look, sometimes, often what happens when we come along the spiritual life is we're in a particularly negative state, and we've been doing our best not to look at it. Like, we've really been putting it into the cupboard and trying to avoid it as much as we possibly can, and just, running ourselves into the ground with anything that we can manage to do to avoid that thing. And it might then need to come into awareness. It might need to actually come into consciousness, and you might actually have to face up to the fact as to how much difficulty is there. That's one of the things that happens in meditation, for example. Quite often we come to meditation thinking ourselves quite lovely people, and give it a few months and you realize that actually you're a fuming pile of hatred and ill will or something like that. Because that's the unenlightened experience. Now, if your spiritual life or your religious life or your Buddhist life or whatever, or just your life continues along those lines of healing, well then you're just going to pour more and more energy into trying to be free from this state of disease, i.e. you're going to start privileging disease and illness in your experience all the time. Views are very subtle like this, very, very hard to spot. I remember on a solitary retreat many years ago, I realized that I had a view that life was there to be survived. Now, it wasn't a conscious view, but it's a view that I had sort of just inhabited. It was from, a point in my life where life was actually there to be survived. I was very, very depressed, and what I needed to do was just get through it. Yeah, so it was a view that possibly even stood to me for a time, but I kept that view long, long beyond its sort of usefulness state. And of course, if life is there to be survived, then the business of life is survival, and survival requires difficulty. So you just keep on recreating difficulty in your life, in your mind, the way that you look at life in your experience, in order for it to be survived. So the views are very, very subtle like that. The Buddha said, when at the start of the class I talked about how this path of purification is a path not only of emotional states, but particularly, and maybe even the majority, of views. And I don't mean political views or any other views in that particular way, although it might be included in that. I mean the incredibly subtle unconscious views that we carry way below the sort of level of our conscious awareness, which will just be a complete mystery to us until, with enough meditation, enough communication, enough friendship, enough all of those things, they start to come to the surface, and we start to clarify them and then purify them on that basis. So you need a very, very strong sense of what's positive and what you're moving towards, and you need to keep that in your mind a lot of the time, and you probably need to privilege it in your awareness as well. Yes, we need an awareness of what's wrong and what we're looking to move away from, i.e. this state of ill health, and move much more towards a state of health. Okay. Is there anything else on that? Any questions?
I just have one.
Yeah.
I think I get what you're saying, but just to simplify, like the word manifestation is very popular, and a lot of people speak about.
Yeah.
Are you, in a roundabout way, saying what I hear a lot is, rather than saying I'm healing, you should say I am healed?
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
Just
yeah, exactly. There might be a point where you just have to go, look, there's nothing wrong. I'm grand.
But
You
what
know?
if there is? I don't
Well,
get it.
well, there might be. There still might be, and we might also need to give an awareness of that. But probably also we might be in a state in our lives where that's just coming. It's just coming into our view,
Yeah.
and we probably do just need to keep on looking at that for a time and sort of unpacking it. But also, as well, at the same time, having a very strong North Star, which is much more positive, which we're also looking to move towards,
Okay.
and probably putting that in the primary position in our awareness.
Do you mean by that having a faith that this will be
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah, exactly.
So
yeah.
not. Okay. Thank you.
Faith is a good term, actually. Yeah, it's a good way of
Yeah.
thinking about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah, that's right.
I was just going to ask if you're getting at the kind of shift from healing to growing, the sort of like negative tense to the positive.
Yeah, yeah.
Moving forward, is that
Yeah.
kind of what you're?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Anything that sort of emphasizes what you're going towards as opposed to what you're moving away
Okay.
from. Yeah, that's right.